Now, personally, I don't. If I had a libertarian society, and I would want anybody there who's a libertarian, regardless of their race or ethnicity. Because I've had people, because like I said, I don't support the rip the borders open right now position, and I've had people say, oh, well, you must be a racist or a xenophobe or something. No, that's not true. I would rather have somebody like yourself who's of Indian ancestry, or somebody who's black, like Nicholas Wildstar, or well, Larry Sharp. I guess Larry Sharp technically half black, but whatever. You know what I mean? I would rather have somebody like that who's a libertarian than have a white person who is not. Mm-hmm. So my goal is not to form an ethno-state or ethno-territory, or my goal is freedom. Mm-hmm. You know. Now, I do think that if people want to have an ethno-territory, I wouldn't necessarily call it a state, but an ethno-enclave, I think if they use voluntary means to get it, they should be able to do it. Mm-hmm. But I don't think they should be able to initiate force and fraud in the process. But anyway, do you see a problem with that can be caused by cultural displacement? In other words, bringing in so many immigrants from a culture that's, and it could even be, let's say, I've used this example before. Do 1 million Italians have the right to move to Iceland? I don't think they do. You know what I mean? I think if the people from Iceland don't want them there, then I don't think 1 million Italians, have a right to move into Iceland. So anyway, do you think that there's, I think that this is like this, kind of mass, status, forced association immigration is sort of being, shall we say, manipulated, that it's kind of trying to tear down societies, kind of like get rid of the Constitution. I don't mean get rid of the Constitution to have an anarcho-capitalist society. I mean get rid of the Constitution to have like global socialism. Anyway, what is your take on that and the whole immigration issue?
There's a lot of things that I have to say about that. Mm-hmm. The first thing I want to say is the most important thing we need to do is to end the welfare state. And I do believe that in the context of no welfare, I 100% support open borders. In the context of welfare, now we have a tricky situation. And here are some of the intermediate steps that I would take right now. Right now, we have, insanely enough, a cap on skilled labor. I would eliminate that entirely. Right now, we are literally telling the people who are the most productive, who are the most educated in the world, you can't come here. And that's honestly very stupid. That would be like keeping out oil. It would be like keeping out computers. You're keeping out the most important resource in the world, which is skilled labor. So those are some of the small changes that I would make right now. The big changes are ending the welfare state entirely. But I also want to talk a little bit on the topic of ethnostates, because I've spoken on this at some length. I support a person's right to private property. I support a person's right to form their own ethnostate. However, I don't think it's a good idea. Historically, ethnostates have been weak. One of the classic examples of this is Japan during the 1700s. Japan was a culture entirely built around war. If you read Japanese history, it seems like the samurai were the only people there because they were the only people worth mentioning. They had an advanced military. They were all about fighting. And then they closed themselves off from the West. They didn't want dirty Westerners around. The result was that they fell basically 200 years behind their competition. So while I do, and that was the result of having ethnostate, and then they just got beaten down by the countries that were involved in cultural exchange and debate and all that kind of stuff. You can see that inside of the United States of America.
Well, isn't Japan still kind of pretty much an ethno-state today? I mean, isn't their population something like 97 or 98% ethnic Japanese?
There's a big difference, which is that they did, at the time, they were keeping out all Westerners. Now they no longer.
So they weren't trading. They were trading. You're talking about an issue of trade having people come in for business.
When I've talked to many people who are of not Japanese descent who live in Japan. Mm-hmm. It doesn't seem like Japan only allows Japanese people in there. And that cultural exchange is one of the things that keeps Japan strong. The lack of it is also keeping Japan weak. Mm-hmm. If you've ever been in a Japanese car, you might have noticed that if you're below a certain size, it's a lot more comfortable than if you're above a certain size. I think a few American engineers over there could probably help them out quite a bit in that area. Mm-hmm. But Japan now, having opened itself up to some cultural exchange, is much stronger than it was when it just had entirely isolated itself.
Well, you know what this reminds me of? Are you familiar with Hans Hermann Hoppe?
I have a T-shirt that has his face on it.
Yeah, he's kind of a controversial figure in the libertarian movement. Some people love him, some people hate him. Now, I find that most of the people who hate him have never really read his work. I personally like him myself. Now, I like a lot of different people. I like people who disagree with him. I don't think a person has to totally agree with me on everything in order, or you know what I mean? I accept people who disagree with me. Like, I disagree with a guy who's here on... partially disagree anyway with Adam Kokesh. You know, he says rip the borders open now, but his political platform is to shut down the federal government. Everything would go back to the states, and he ultimately goes to the same conclusion that I do, is that we should have a private property anarcho-capitalist society. But I disagree with his interim of rip the borders open right now, that position. Did you see his debate with Stefan Molyneux on the issue? They had a debate.
I didn't see that.
Okay, well, I didn't agree with Adam's side on that debate, but I still like Adam. He's a great guy, a hell of a good guy, and I very well may end up supporting him for president in 2020. And I agree with him for the most part. But anyway, Hans Hermann Hoppe wrote an essay called "The Case for Restricted Immigration and Free Trade." And it kind of sounds like what you were just talking about with Japan, because Japan, well, they do let some foreigners in for work. They don't let just any foreigner in, and it's very, very difficult to get Japanese citizenship. Now, are you familiar with Roger Ver, the Bitcoin Jesus?
No.
Okay, well, he's a libertarian that made a lot of money in Bitcoin. He has a nickname Bitcoin Jesus because he's very generous and he preaches the Bitcoin gospel. Sure. Anyway, he spends a lot of time in Japan, but he does not have Japanese citizenship, and he's a rich white guy, and he actually he ended up renouncing his American citizenship, and he got citizenship in Nevis and Kitts, which is an island in the Caribbean. Anyway, the point that I'm making is what you were saying about Japan doesn't really so much sound like a case of immigration, but rather what Hoppe was talking about was the case for restricted immigration and free trade.
That's an interesting point, and the reason that I bring up the Japanese example is because it was the cultural exchange or the lack thereof that made Japan weak. And it's a cultural exchange, not just the trade exchange. It's the cultural exchange, as minimal as it may be, as small as it may be, that is a critical difference. Japan, with a little bit of cultural exchange, is a rock star. With more, I think they would be better. But here's the thing: there's a difference between cultural exchange and encouraging welfare parasitism. And what we're doing right now is encouraging welfare parasitism.
And I think that's what's happening in some European countries, like Sweden and Germany and England. And here's another interesting thing. I've had some libertarians say, oh, well, you want a big police state to keep out immigrants, which I don't. The countries of Liechtenstein and Luxembourg and Switzerland, all of which are in Europe, they're not being overrun by, destructive migrants, and none of them have a big police state. They're all actually rated very high on the Freedom Index. The countries that are being overrun with destructive migrants are like Sweden and Germany and France and the Netherlands and UK, and the reason is because of their welfare state.
And one of the reasons that I actually disagree with Hoppe on his position on immigration is because he talks about bringing in people who share what he says who share our cultural values, and he specifically talks about Germany, about Britain, about France, the biggest welfare states in the world. And they don't share my values. I don't believe in welfarism. I don't believe in a national health service. I don't believe in the French. The French, I don't know if you've been paying attention to this. This is kind of a smaller aspect of their law, but they've banned at-will paternity testing, which to me is just another part of individualizing welfarism. To me, I don't support those values. Those are not my values. Those are not good values. So what I want to see is creating a situation. Remember, we talked about, do non-libertarians, are they allowed to work at the Libertarian National Headquarters? Yeah, sure, they're allowed to, but they never will, because no one but a true believer would put in those kind of hours for that kind of money. I want to make this country such that only people who agree with the values of anti-welfarism would ever want to come here. I want there to be no welfare state, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no government schools, no food stamps, nothing. So the only people who would ever want to come here would actually share our values. You can't tell some of these values by their ethnicity. I've met people who are very hardworking of every race. I've met people who are super welfare leeches of every race. It's a question. The question is, can we make this a place that attracts people who share our values, because those are the only values that would survive here.
Yeah, well, my ultimate goal would be the private property anarcho-capitalist model, which I talked about a few moments ago. But my interim, this would be my interim proposal for immigration. Okay, number one, if you come to this country, you get no welfare. Nothing. Whether you come in legally or illegally, you get no welfare. Maybe even if they come in legally, they sign like a contract saying that they will not collect welfare.
As long as we include government schools.
Yeah.
Because it's not the 15 cents of food stamps that matter, it's the $500 billion in government schools that are the real welfare state.
Yeah, so there should be no government welfare for immigrants. I don't think there should be for American citizens either, but I could say that you could make the argument American citizens at least paid into the system. And trying to take it away from American citizens is going to be a lot more difficult, politically speaking, than denying it to immigrants. I agree with you; it should be done. But I'm just saying, I'm talking about the interim.
In terms of a political, and this is something that can bring us closer to the ultimate goal. In terms of creating a world of competing private governments, of small anarcho-capitalist states, what we need to get rid of is actually the least popular program of all. That's foreign aid. Because here's the fact. We end all foreign aid, countries are going to run out of money. And that means some of them will start to do what countries have historically done, which is selling off sovereign land. And if we get a bunch of countries competing to sell off sovereign land, we have small countries, kind of like a Hong Kong type model, but instead of one Hong Kong, which has become this major cultural and intellectual and financial and technological center, I want 1,000 Hong Kongs.
So you know about Liberland?
I do.
Yeah, I met Vijay Laika.
Really?
Yeah.
That must have been wild.
Anyway, so back to, I just want to give you the interim immigration program.
Okay, go ahead.
No welfare for immigrants.
No complaints from me there.
Okay, and then I would say, now this might be a point of controversy among some libertarians, but if you come into the country illegally, then you can't become an American citizen. I would only offer citizenship to people who come in legally, and I would make it more difficult to become a citizen.
I would do it differently than that.
Okay, well, Okay, so I would get rid of birthright citizenship. And there's some arguments that birthright citizenship was only meant to apply to former slaves, and so I would eliminate birthright citizenship. And I would make it harder to become an American citizen. What I would like to see, if, let's say I was elected president and I was not running on an Adam Kokesh, Daryl Perry type platform, which I agree with them, but let's say I decided to run on more of a Michael Badnarik or Harry Brown, where I'm not going to totally abolish government, but I'm going to severely cut it. I would like to appoint Tom Woods as head of the Department of Immigration and Naturalization, and have all would-be immigrants take his Liberty classroom. I think that they should have an extensive, a thorough knowledge of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, free market economics, and I would include a special class on the right to keep and bear arms that would come, that would include trips to a firing range. Because, I think that there's too many, if you look at the statistics, and I'm not saying all immigrants are doing this, but the statistics show that supermajorities of modern day immigrants do in fact support welfare programs and do in fact support gun control laws.
A supermajority of naturally born American citizens also support welfare programs.
Well,
they just don't call it that because they're blind to the basic fact that government schools are welfare.
Oh, that's a fair point. And but these people also, but the thing is though that the schools would still exist, and the military and some of these other government jobs, roads, the people who pave the roads, the libraries, these are services that would still exist in the free market. Now if we were in a free market, the welfare would not exist unless it was a charitable contribution. And there are plenty of things wrong with the existing American population. I'm not denying that, okay? But what I'm saying is I feel like that there's a lot of immigrants coming to this country that frankly are kind of, I'm not saying all of them. Again, I'm not saying all of them. I recognize there's exceptions. We got Lily Tang, who's a Chinese American or Chinese immigrant, and she's a hardcore libertarian, and I think Lily Tang is absolutely fantastic, and she's an example of the type of immigrant we should have in this country. But anyway, I would part of the becoming an American citizen is you swear an oath to protect and defend the U.S. Constitution. And how can you swear your immigration oath to become an American citizen while at the same time you support gun control and you support Marxist wealth redistribution, both of which are unconstitutional? So in my opinion, there's mass fraud being implemented by the Department of Immigration and Naturalization, that they're swearing in large numbers of people who don't even understand the oath that they're swearing to. Now, I understand there are cops and military and politicians that do the same thing, but and that's another issue. But what I'm saying is, so anyway, so basically, to sum up, my proposal is, number one, no welfare for immigrants. Number two, if you in birthright citizenship, make the citizenship process more difficult. And that's basically what they do in Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein, they don't offer any welfare to immigrants. And it's very difficult to become a citizen in Liechtenstein. You have to live there for like 30 years, and very few people get Liechtenstein citizenship. Well, guess what, though? Liechtenstein is not having the problems that these other countries in Europe are having with migrants. So anyway, what are your thoughts on this is an interim proposal, just like some libertarians will freak out at that. I've had libertarians attack me for making these proposals as an interim thing. And I do think there's a case for kicking some immigrants out of the country, like the quote-unquote physical removal that Hans Hermann Hoppe talks about. Like I read about a couple of cases recently. I posted articles online about these Somalian migrants that came in under the Refugee Resettlement Act, which is a government welfare program, and in Minnesota got caught defrauding the welfare system. Now, it was bad enough that they were on welfare to begin with, but they actually were defrauding it, and they defrauded the welfare system out of millions and millions of dollars. And then there was another group of Somali. I'm not trying to just pick on Somalians. I'm just using this for this example. Okay. In Maine, that basically been committing a lot of crimes and like took over a public park in Lewiston, Maine. De facto took over a public park, and they've been violently assaulting people. And there's a video online of some of these Somali migrants beating a man to death with sticks, and they're laughing about it. Now, I said in a comment thread where some other libertarians were posting that these people should be physically removed from the country. And I couldn't get anybody else to say that or to even take a position on it. Like, they were too chicken to say anything. And so anyway, what are your thoughts on my interim proposal of no welfare, make the citizenship process more difficult, and I might even also include a contract where you can't work as a lobbyist for another country, and if you work as a lobbyist for another country, another government, like the what do they call it, APAC, the American Israeli Political Action Committee, maybe even say sign a contract. If you're going to come into this country, you cannot lobby on behalf of another government. And if you do, you get deported or something. And, kicking some people out of the country, like those examples that I just gave about the Somali migrants defrauding the welfare system and committing violent crime. What are your thoughts on that? So, sorry, I rambled on a little bit, but it took me a little while to explain the position. Sure.
So I have a lot of thoughts on this. I'm going to quote a couple. I'm actually an atheist, but I'm going to quote a couple of people who come from a more religious background. One is one of my favorite motivational speakers, Joel Osteen. He's a preacher. And he talks about meeting this guy, and he says, you got to pray for me because I've been married 4 times, and every single time, the people that I marry, they run around on me. And Joel says to the audience, he's like, I couldn't help but thinking the one commonality here is you. Jesus said, don't fixate on the mote in someone else's eye while ignoring the log in your own eye. And when we're talking about welfarism, when we're talking about defrauding, what does it mean to defraud welfare? It means to collect welfare when you have enough money to not collect welfare. And the largest group of people who are collecting welfare when they don't really need welfare is all the people who are using government schools. Government schools are it is one of the biggest government programs. It is the largest welfare program in the world. We talk about people from Somalia coming over here and doing some acts of violence, but we forget that we have Americans in government uniforms going over there and committing far larger, far worse, far more reprehensible acts of violence. Do I believe...
Oh, I agree with you, but one doesn't justify the other.
That's true. One does not justify the other. if we are going to keep this welfare state alive, we cannot be surprised when we attract leeches. Our number one immigration goal must be the complete end of every part of every single aspect of the welfare state. It should also be focused on making sure that we do have the ability to protect ourselves. I do believe that Americans, anyone has the right to keep and bear any arms, and that does include automatic weapons. And I do want people who are coming to America to think, oh my God, if you don't work hard in America, you're going to starve to death. And if you try to rob somebody, they're going to cut you in half with a machine gun. I want that to be the understanding of America. The fact that it's not the understanding of America is not people in Somalia's fault, that's our fault. We need to end welfare. We need to eliminate all restrictions on the right to keep and bear arms, including automatic weapons. And we need to make it clear that if you're coming here to work, come here to work, because our culture is a culture of work. Our culture, I hope, is not a culture of Europeanism, because Europeanism has turned into the worst kind of welfare combined with the worst kind of human rights violations. European culture has created the National Health Service in England, one of the greatest abominations on earth, and is also doing things like, as I mentioned before, banning at-will paternity testing, which I do consider to be an absolute human rights violation. I don't want us to import that culture either. I don't want us to import Somali culture, because I don't think it's that good. I think there's probably elements of it we could learn from, but I don't think we should mimic it. I don't want us to import Japanese culture either. There's great things we can learn from the Japanese, but we should not mimic it. What we should import is the culture of innovation and hard work, and saying that if you are not ready to innovate and do hard work, this is not a place where it makes sense for you to come. And that's the changes that I would support in a second in any way that I could.
Yeah, well, some libertarians kind of act like that because the government manages the land and we have all these commons, that the commons should be open to everybody on the planet. And, I disagree with that. I think that if, let's say somebody steals my car. Okay, it's still my car. The government steals my money through taxes and then uses it to buy a road. Well, it's still like my road. Like I kind of own a piece of the road. And like if we lived in a private community, like Disney World. Okay, Disney World, and this isn't the best example, but it's an example that everybody knows about, so I'm going to use it. Disney World is kind of like a de facto private city. Sure. Say like, okay, do I have a right to just waltz into Disney World and just start using their road without buying a ticket and complying with their rules? Like some people think that like if you're an immigrant that you have a right to use the taxpayer-funded commons in any country. And
I don't support the existence of taxpayer-funded commons.
Well, I don't either. But the fact is that they do exist. So what do you do while they're existing?
While they're existing is not a position that I have any opinion on. They should not exist.
Yeah.
That's like saying...
But we have to live in the here and now.
While that's like saying if somebody is trying to sexually assault you, you should try to stop it. Mm-hmm. You should do everything you possibly can. You should bite and kick and scream or do whatever you can. If you know somebody's planning to sexually assault you, you should shoot them. Mm-hmm. Or use nonviolent methods. You should do something. I do not believe that the shortcomings of our government should dictate the way in which we interact with the world. You're right. Immigrants don't have the right to use the commons. Neither do American citizens. The commons should be sold, and that money should be used to cut taxes.
But the difference is the American citizens, the same would be true in every other country, paid for it. So, like, we paid for it, and, maybe our parents or Well, everybody pays some kind of taxes, and even if you didn't pay taxes,
even
maybe
immigrants pay some kind of tax.
Well, yeah, but I'm saying they're not from here. Like in other words, somebody who was born in this country, I think, has a greater claim to the land and the commons than somebody who is a latecomer.
I would say that no one has any right, because that's like saying if you're doing a gang rape of somebody, whose gets to be there? No one. It's always wrong.
Yeah.
No, the existence of common land owned by a government is fundamentally morally wrong. There is no way where it's slightly more right or less right. It is always wrong. It's just like the welfare state. Welfare for the middle class is not better than food stamps. It is just as bad, because all theft-funded welfare is wrong for the exact same reasons.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's also the operating in the here and now, and here's an example I've used. Okay, it's like, I'm a libertarian, I'm against government-funded fire departments. Mm-hmm. But, okay, let's say my house catches on fire, and there's no free market alternative fire department. Now, what do I do? Say, well, dude, I'm an anarchist, man, so I don't believe in using the state, so I'm just going to let my house burn down. You know what I mean? Or are you going to call the government fire department? Like, you know, are you going to say, well, I'm an anarchist, so I'm not going to drive on the government roads. You know, I'm an anarchist and my car got stolen, and so I'm not going to call the police to try to get my car back. In other words, you can be an anarchist, which, you know, I would call myself an anarcho-capitalist.
Is the suggestion?
But what I'm saying is that like you have to like operate in the here and now. Like, you know, would you say it's
that an immigrant shouldn't call the fire department?
No. What I'm saying is we have to. You were talking about that the taxpayer-funded commons, you know, shouldn't exist, and I agree with you.
I don't think they should exist.
I agree with you. But being that we have to live in the world as it is right now. Like we don't.
We have to fight it. I mean,
May I interrupt a
Sure.
moment?
Sure.
We've crossed swords once or twice on the internet. I'm Tom Bailey.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Tom Bailey. Nice to meet
I
you.
gave you my vote today,
Appreciate that.
and well, I'm not fully supportive of you, but I gave you that vote.
Well, this is going to be a really cool interview when it gets on YouTube. My YouTube channel is Libertarian Revolution, so just go to Libertarian Revolution, and this will be popping up on YouTube soon. But anyway, just about to close up here with Arvin Vohra. So.
Check out my videos.
You're running for Senate. What is your website?
My website is Vohra. Then my last name is spelled VOHRA.com.
Okay, and let's just say you were hypothetically elected to the Senate. How would you handle immigration right now as a U.S. Senator?
My first step would be to eliminate the H1 cap. My second, actually, no, that would be my second step. My first step would be to do everything I can to defund as much of the welfare state as I can.
Would you repeal or vote for repealing the Refugee Resettlement Act, which is a government welfare program?
I honestly don't know enough about the program, but I can tell you what I would not support. I would not support a type of immigration that is going to predictably and massively increase welfarism. So if that's what that act does, then yeah, I probably wouldn't support it. I do believe it is insane to create, if you're going to put limits on immigration in the context of a welfare state, I do believe it is insane to prioritize refugees over skilled labor. I will not prioritize refugees over skilled labor.
So you prioritize skilled labor that can actually add something to the American economy.
And that's not to say that I don't believe that any refugees could ever add anything. Clearly there's many who have.
There might be some, yes.
But what I will do is this. My priorities are going to be what makes sense for America. And that does mean that if I have to choose, and I hope I don't have to choose, my plan is to end the welfare state, open the borders wide, say, come on in here, but recognize that if you don't work, you won't eat, and if you try to steal, someone's going to cut you in half with a machine gun. That's what I want. That's the goal I'm going to be working towards. My first phase is going to be really to do everything I can to defund welfare, including trying to encourage government shutdowns. I want government shutdowns. I want that whole thing to just not be working at any time. So including trying to encourage things like that. But I will be prioritizing as much as I can the type of immigration that I do believe is the most beneficial to America as a whole. And so I will be absolutely prioritizing, and I've said this many times. I've said it on Facebook, I've said it in public, that it is insane for us to have an H1 cap at all. But it is even more insane for us to put the H1 cap lower than the refugee cap. And that's basically what we have right now.
Yeah, so basically my point is just that I don't mind productive, freedom-loving immigrants from coming to this country. In fact, I'm even for it. But I don't like people who are, you know, socialist, communist, criminals, you know, welfare seekers, and people with communicable diseases coming in. And if some of those people, you know, some people say, oh, well, they could sneak in. Well, yes, some of them may sneak in anyway. That's true. But you don't have to reward them once they get here by giving them welfare programs and government citizenship.
As you know, I'm going to do everything I can to shut down every welfare program humanly possible.
Right on. And that's Arvin Vohra for U.S. Senate. And if you live in Maryland, I highly encourage you to vote for Arvin Vohra and go look him up online and go make a donation to his website. He is the best candidate in the U.S. Senate race in Maryland in 2018. Thanks a lot.